The Alpha King made a new enemy, but he did not expect to fall in love with her. The council chamber stretched before Magnus, cold like a throat waiting to swallow dissent, all stone and shadow, and the particular silence that came when predators gathered in confined spaces. He stood at the head of the obsidian table, 6 feet and 7 inches of controlled violence wrapped in human skin, his pale golden eyes moving across the faces of the territorial alphas who had traveled through snow and frozen earth to attend this gathering. They feared him, these lesser pack leaders, feared him with the kind of terror that made them bow their heads when he entered a room, that made their wolves whimper and expose their throats even when they tried to project strength. The fortress around them hummed with his presence, with the weight of a power so absolute it had reshaped the political landscape of the Northern Territories over the course of 11 years, ever since he had taken the throne at 23, in a series of consolidation wars that still haunted the collective memory of every pack within 1,000 miles. Magnus listened to their reports with half his attention, the other half occupied by the restlessness that had plagued him for weeks now, a sensation like teeth against the inside of his skull, like his wolf pacing endless circles in a cage too small to contain it. Alpha Hendrix from the Eastern Valley spoke of border disputes, his voice careful, measured, aware that a wrong word might transform the temperature of the room from merely cold to lethally frigid. Alpha Morrison reported livestock losses, probably rogues, nothing significant. The rhythm of governance, the maintenance of order, the enforcement of laws that kept their hidden world separate from the humans who live ignorant and fragile in their cities and towns. Then Hugo Winter spoke, his beta's steel-gray eyes meeting his with the particular steadiness of someone who had earned the right to deliver bad news without flinching. 3 outposts, Hugo said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation like a blade through silk. 3 simultaneous strikes, coordinated to the minute, executed with a precision that suggested military training and intimate knowledge of their security rotations. The rogues had freed 47 imprisoned wolves, stolen enough weapons and supplies to arm a small militia, and vanished into the wilderness before reinforcements could arrive. No casualties among the attackers, minimal among the defenders, which somehow made it worse, made it feel less like a raid and more like a message. Magnus felt his wolf surge against his control, felt the familiar burn of transformation threatening at the base of his spine, in his fingertips, behind his eyes. The air in the chamber grew heavier, thicker, saturated with the kind of dominance that made the lesser alphas lean back in their chairs despite themselves. He forced his breathing to remain steady, forced his hands to stay relaxed on the table's cold surface, forced his voice to emerge calm and measured when everything in him wanted to roar. Who leads them, he asked, and Hugo's pause told him everything before words did. Intelligence suggested a woman, Hugo said, someone who had been building a network for years, recruiting displaced wolves, offering protection to those fleeing pack justice or persecution, someone tactically brilliant, charismatic enough to inspire loyalty in rogues who, by definition, had rejected pack structure, someone who had been careful, until now, to avoid direct confrontation with his territory specifically. The council chamber erupted into speculation, into suggestions ranging from increased patrols to wholesale slaughter of any wolf found without pack affiliation. Magnus let them talk, let them perform their theories and solutions like offerings laid at an altar, his mind already moving through possibilities, through the strategic implications of an organized rogue force led by someone skilled enough to humiliate his defenses. It was Alpha Cordova, younger than the others, and still foolish enough to mistake Magnus's silence for invitation, who suggested that perhaps the king had grown soft, that perhaps the legendary Cold Wolf had lost his edge after so many years of unchallenged rule. The temperature dropped so fast that frost formed on the surface of the water glasses. Magnus moved without conscious thought, his hand closing around Cordova's throat with enough pressure to cut off air, but not enough to crush, lifting the smaller alpha from his chair as easily as one might lift a child. He felt his eyes shift, felt the gold bleed to molten amber, felt his wolf rise close enough to the surface that his nails extended into claws that pressed against Cordova's jugular with the delicate precision of a surgeon's blade. The other alphas sat frozen, their wolves screaming at them to submit, to run, to do anything except draw the attention of the predator that had just reminded them why he ruled and they served. "Question my strength again," Magnus said, his voice emerging lower, rougher, half-transformed, "and I will demonstrate exactly how soft I have become by decorating this chamber with your intestines. Do you understand me?" He released Cordova, who collapsed back into his chair, gasping, nodding frantically, his wolf already belly up in absolute surrender. Magnus straightened his shirt, smoothed his platinum hair back into place, let his eyes fade back to their usual pale gold, and dismissed the council with a gesture. They filed out quickly, quietly, their fear a palpable taste on his tongue that should have satisfied his wolf, but instead only sharpened the strange restlessness into something almost painful. Hugo remained, because Hugo always remained, had remained through wars and political purges, and the particular loneliness that came with absolute power. They stood in silence for a long moment, the kind of silence that existed between men who had fought together, bled together, killed together, in the service of building something that would outlast them both. Within 6 hours, Magnus had the rogue network member in an interrogation room 3 levels below the fortress's main structure, the kind of room designed to muffle screaming and facilitate the extraction of information through methods that blur the line between questioning and torture. But the wolf, a thin man in his 30s with the haunted eyes of someone who had seen too much and survived too long, broke easily, almost eagerly, as if he had been waiting for permission to betray his leader in exchange for mercy. "She is the Stone Heir," the wolf said, his voice shaking, his submission absolute. "The daughter of Alpha Stone, the one who survived when you destroyed the Western Coastal Pack. She calls herself Vera Stone, and she has sworn to make you pay for every life you took that night." Magnus felt something cold slide down his spine, something that might have been recognition or might have been premonition, or might have been the first whisper of a fate he could not yet see clearly. He remembered the Western Coastal Pack, remembered the intelligence that had pointed to them as harboring his sister's killers, remembered the rage that had driven him to sanction their destruction 7 years ago, remembered the reports that the Alpha's family had been eliminated to prevent future vengeance claims. But here was evidence that someone had survived, that a daughter had escaped and spent 7 years building toward this moment, toward him. He left the interrogation room and climbed to the fortress's highest tower, the private space where he went when he needed to think without the weight of watching eyes and careful political calculations. The window looked out over endless wilderness, over territories he had conquered and consolidated and controlled through a combination of strategic brilliance and overwhelming force. Somewhere in that wilderness, the Stone Heir was watching, planning, preparing her next move. His wolf stirred again, that same strange restlessness intensifying into something he could not name, something that felt almost like anticipation. 8 years ago, he had found his sister's body on the border, throat torn open, left like refuse to mark territory and send a message. The grief had been a living thing, had driven him half mad until he channeled it into vengeance, into the destruction of everyone intelligence had suggested bore responsibility. He had thought it finished, had thought the debt paid in blood and ash and the screaming of those who had taken the only family he had left. Now it seems the debt had merely been transferred, passed to a survivor who carried her own.
Grief like a blade aimed at his heart. Magnus Cold pressed his hand against the frozen window glass and smiled, without humor, without warmth, with only the cold acknowledgement of a predator recognizing a worthy hunt. "Come for me then, Vera Stone," he whispered to the wilderness. "Let us see which of us has the stronger claim to vengeance." The Alpha King made a new enemy, but he did not expect to fall in love with her. 14 days passed like water through fingers, each one marked by false leads and near misses that left Magnus with the particular frustration of a predator whose prey understood pursuit as well as he did. He tracked Vera Stone's network through the wilderness with methodical precision, following the breadcrumb trail of scattered rogues and abandoned campsites, interrogating every wolf whose scent carried even a whisper of connection to the Stone Heir. His methods were efficient, brutal when necessary, surgical in their application of pressure and pain to extract information. Hugo accompanied him through most of it, his beta's presence a steady and counterweight to the obsession that had begun to consume him in ways he could not fully articulate. "You have not slept more than 3 hours in any night since we began this hunt," Hugo observed on the 10th day, his voice carefully neutral as they stood over a map spread across the hood of their vehicle, markers indicating sightings and probable routes. "This is not like you, Magnus. You are always calculated, always strategic, but this feels personal in a way that concerns me." Magnus did not look up from the map, his finger tracing a pattern that suggested Vera was leading them in deliberate circles, testing his commitment, studying his methods. "Everything I do is personal," he said. "She has declared war on my territory, on my authority, on the stability I have spent 11 years building. Of course it is personal." But Hugo's gray eyes saw too much, had always seen too much, and the silence that followed carried the weight of unspoken observations about the particular quality of Magnus's fixation, about the way he kept the interrogation reports about Vera herself separate from the tactical assessments, reading them late at night when he thought no one was watching. The supply convoy moved through the mountain pass on the 13th day, heavily guarded because Magnus had learned that Vera preferred targets that appeared vulnerable but were actually traps, that she was too smart to take obvious bait. 50 wolves in various states of transformation surrounded the vehicles, weapons ready, senses extended into the forest that pressed close on either side of the narrow road. Magnus rode in the lead vehicle, his window down, despite the cold, his wolf pushing against his skin with an insistence that had been growing steadily stronger as they entered this particular section of territory. She hit them at the narrowest point, where the rock walls rose steep on both sides, and maneuverability became a liability rather than an asset. The first vehicle exploded, not with fire, but with some kind of compressed air charge that flipped it sideways and blocked the road without causing casualties. A calculated choice that told Magnus she still operated under some code of engagement that distinguished between enemy and victim. Then they came from above, from the rocks themselves. 24 wolves in full transformation dropping into the convoy with coordinated precision that spoke of extensive training and absolute trust in their leader. Magnus was out of his vehicle before it fully stopped, his transformation already halfway complete, bones reshaping and muscles expanding and senses sharpening into the crystalline clarity that came with his wolf form. He was massive, even among shifters, his platinum fur marked with the scars of 100 previous battles, his size and strength the physical manifestation of the power that had made him king. He tore through 2 of Vera's wolves without particular effort, non-lethal strikes meant to disable rather than kill, because something in him resisted the idea of slaughtering her followers like they were his sister's murderers, like they deserved the same fate he had delivered to the Western Coastal Pack. Then he saw her, and his wolf did something it had never done before, something that made him stumble mid-strike and nearly
lost him his throat to an enemy's fangs. She moved through the battle like water, like violence given form and purpose, her copper-red fur bright against the gray stone, her size smaller than his, but her speed and precision almost supernatural in their efficiency. She was beautiful in the way that dangerous things were beautiful, in the way that storms and avalanches and forest fires were beautiful, and his wolf wanted to chase her, wanted to catch her, wanted to pin her down and sink teeth into her throat and taste her blood and her submission, and something else his human mind could not quite name. Their eyes met across the chaos of the battle, forest green with gold flecks locking onto his pale gold, and the world contracted to just that connection, to the weight of recognition that passed between them like an electric shock. Her wolf froze the same way his had, her head tilting in confusion, in instinctive response to something neither of them understood. Then one of her wolves called a retreat signal, and the moment shattered, and she was moving again, leading her pack up the rock walls with the same impossible coordination they had displayed coming down. Magnus launched himself after her without thinking, without strategy, driven by pure instinct that overrode 11 years of careful control. He was faster than her wolves, stronger, his claws finding purchase on stone that should have been too smooth to climb. He heard Hugo shouting behind him, heard his beta calling him back, but the words were meaningless noise compared to the imperative that drove him forward, that insisted he could not let her escape, that something fundamental would be lost if he did not catch her now. She led him into a ravine that cut deep into the mountain's flank, away from both their forces, and he understood with the small part of his mind that remained capable of tactical analysis that this was either supremely stupid or supremely confident, that she was either trapping him or trusting her ability to face him alone. The ravine opened into a small clearing, where water had carved smooth stone over centuries, where the afternoon sun cut through in shafts that illuminated the space like a natural arena. Vera Stone shifted back to human form as she landed, her transformation smooth and controlled, and Magnus found himself doing the same without conscious decision, his wolf responding to her choice with automatic reciprocation that should have alarmed him. She was tall for a woman, lean muscle and copper-red hair pulled back in a braid that had half escaped during the fight, 3 claw mark scars visible on her left shoulder that spoke of some past near-death experience. Her forest green eyes studied him with an intensity that matched his own, and for a long moment neither of them moved, both trying to understand what had just happened between their wolves, what invisible force had pulled them away from their respective advantages into this private confrontation. "You killed my father," she said finally, her voice low and rough from transformation, carrying the particular quality of grief that had been aged like wine into something darker and more potent. "You destroyed my pack, everyone I loved, everyone who knew my name before I became just another rogue running from your justice. And now you hunt me like I am the criminal, like I am the monster who murders innocents." Magnus felt his wolf surge with confusion, with denial, with something that might have been guilt if he allowed himself to examine it too closely. "I executed the wolves who killed my sister," he said, and his voice emerged colder than he intended, harder. "The Western Coastal Pack harbored her murderers, protected them, allowed them to escape after leaving her body on my border like garbage. I did what any alpha would do, what the law entitled me to do. Your father paid the price for his pack's crimes." The look she gave him carried such concentrated hatred that it should have triggered his dominance response, should have made his wolf rise up to crush this challenge to his authority. Instead, his wolf whined, actually whined like a subordinate seeking approval, and the confusion of that response made him take a half step back despite himself. "My father knew nothing of your sister's death," Vera said, and she was moving now, circling him with predatory grace, her body coiled, ailed and ready for violence.
The wolves who killed her were not our pack, had never been our pack. But you did not care about truth, did you? You only cared about vengeance, about making someone bleed for your pain. And my pack was convenient, was close enough to your border to make a plausible target. She attacked before he could respond, her transformation explosive and immediate. And then they were fighting in earnest, wolf against wolf in the confined space of the ravine. She was good, better than good, her training evident in every strike encounter, her speed compensating for the difference in their size and strength. Magnus found himself pulling his strikes despite himself, found his wolf unwilling to deliver the killing blows that were available, that his tactical mind screamed at him to take. She had no such hesitation, her teeth finding his shoulder, his flank, his throat once in a glancing strike that should have been fatal if she had committed fully to it. They broke apart after what might have been minutes, or might have been hours, both bleeding, both exhausted, both aware that this fight could continue until one of them died, and neither seemed capable of crossing that final line. Vera shifted back to human first, her chest heaving, blood running from a gash on her ribs that his claws had opened. Magnus followed, his shoulder throbbing where her teeth had torn deep enough to scar. "This is not finished," she said, backing toward the ravine's far exit, her eyes never leaving his. "I will make you pay for what you took from me, Cold. I will destroy everything you have built, everyone you care about, until you understand what loss feels like." Then she was gone, disappearing into the wilderness with speed born of long practice at running and hiding, and Magnus stood alone in the clearing, with her scent burned into his memory, and his wolf howling with confusion and longing, and something that felt dangerously close to grief for something he had not yet lost. Hugo found him there 30 minutes later, and was wise enough not to ask questions about the expression on his king's face, about the way Magnus kept touching his shoulder where her teeth had marked him, about the particular quality of obsession that had transformed from Hunter's focus into something far more dangerous and impossible to name. The Alpha King made a new enemy, but he did not expect to fall in love with her. The intelligence came through Hugo's network 3 days after the ravine encounter, information purchased from a wolf who existed in the gray spaces between pack loyalty and rogue survival, who traded secrets for protection and had no particular allegiance to either side of this expanding conflict. Neutral territory gathering, the message said, a meeting between Vera Stone and potential allies from the Southern Ridge Pack, wolves who had grown dissatisfied with their alpha's cooperation with Magnus's consolidation policies. The location was a lodge that straddled the border between controlled territory and the wildlands, a place where pack law theoretically held no weight and violence was prohibited by ancient accords that predated Magnus's reign by centuries. Magnus studied the information with the cold calculation that had served him well in a decade of political maneuvering, seeing immediately the opportunity it represented, the chance to end this pursuit before Vera's movement gathered enough momentum to become a genuine threat to territorial stability. Hugo stood across from him in the strategy room, his expression carrying the particular neutrality that meant he disagreed, but would not voice opposition unless asked directly. "You have concerns," Magnus said, not looking up from the maps and intelligence reports spread across the table between them. "The neutral territory accords exist for a reason," Hugo replied carefully. "If you violate them, even with justification, you risk alienating the Council of Elders, risk giving other packs legitimate grievance against your authority. Vera Stone is one rogue, Magnus, regardless of how organized her followers are. Is she worth potentially destabilizing the political framework you have spent years constructing?" Magnus felt his wolf stir at the mention of her name, felt that same confusing pull that had plagued him since the ravine, since her teeth had marked his shoulder in a scar that
it had healed physically but remained present in ways he could not explain. "Yes," he said simply, and the certainty in his voice ended the discussion because Hugo knew him well enough to recognize when argument would be futile. They moved on to Neutral Territory Lodge with 40 wolves, enough to overwhelm any reasonable resistance, but not so many as to appear like an invading army. Magnus had planned the operation with surgical precision, accounting for exit routes and probable defensive positions, predicting Vera's tactical responses based on everything he had learned about her methods over the past weeks. The lodge sat in a clearing surrounded by forest that would provide cover for his forces, and the meeting was scheduled for twilight, that liminal time when visibility decreased and wolves grew naturally more aggressive, more prone to transformation and violence. Vera arrived exactly on time, which told him she was confident.
was either unaware of the trap or arrogant enough to believe she could handle whatever came. She brought only 5 wolves with her, a show of good faith for the meeting, and Magnus watched from the forest's edge as she entered the lodge with the particular grace he had come to recognize. The way she moved like violence was always one heartbeat away from manifesting. He gave her 10 minutes inside before signaling the assault, before his wolves surrounded the lodge in concentric circles that cut off every exit route, every avenue of retreat. Then he walked through the front door alone, because some part of him insisted this needed to happen face to face, needed to be witnessed without the buffer of subordinates and political theater. The inside of the lodge was rustic, all timber and stone, a fire burning in the central hearth that cast dancing shadows across walls decorated with ancient pack symbols from territories that no longer existed. Vera stood in the center of the room, her 5 wolves arrayed behind her in defensive formation, and the Southern Ridge representatives were conspicuously absent, had clearly been warned or paid off or frightened away, leaving her exposed and isolated, exactly as Magnus had intended. Her forest green eyes met his with understanding, with fury, with something else he could not quite identify. "You used the neutral territory protocols as bait," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the tension vibrating through her frame. How perfectly predictable, cold. When legal methods fail, simply violate the laws that bind everyone else. "The laws that bind everyone else do not apply to rogues who have declared war on my territory," Magnus replied, moving further into the room with deliberate slowness, aware of her wolves tracking his every movement, calculating odds and vulnerabilities. "You forfeited the protection of pack law when you chose to exist outside it. Surrender now, come peacefully, and I give you my word that you and your followers will receive fair trial under Northern Territory jurisdiction." Vera laughed, the sound sharp and bitter and utterly without humor. "Fair trial," she repeated. "The way my father received a fair trial before you slaughtered him in his own home. The way my pack received fair consideration before you burned our compound and killed everyone inside, children and elders and wolves who had never raised a claw in violence. Your word means nothing to me, Cold. Your justice is just another word for murder when it serves your political interests." Her wolves moved then, their transformation beginning, and Magnus felt his own wolf surge in response, felt the familiar burn of the shift starting. But Vera was faster, was already mid-transformation when she launched herself at him, when the lodge erupted into chaos as his forces breached the doors and windows in coordinated assault. He met her in the air, both of them in full wolf form, and the impact sent them crashing through the timber railing of the second-floor balcony, down into the space below where the hearth fire scattered embers across the floor. The fight was brutal, desperate, her wolves trying to create an opening for escape, while his forces methodically eliminated each avenue of retreat. Magnus grappled with Vera in the center of the destruction, his size advantage negated by the confined space and her superior agility, his wolf still inexplicably reluctant to deliver
the killing strikes that were available. She fought with the fury of someone who had nothing left to lose, with the particular savagery that came from years of grief compressed into this single moment of confrontation. He finally pinned her when 3 of his wolves managed to disable her last bodyguard, when she realized that continued resistance would only result in more casualties among her people. His jaws closed around her throat, not breaking skin, but applying enough pressure to communicate absolute dominance, to trigger the biological imperative that forced even the strongest wolf to submit to overwhelming power. She went still beneath him, her submission mechanical, involuntary, and he felt her hatred burning through the connection between their bodies like acid. Magnus shifted back to human form, keeping one hand locked around her throat as she followed suit, both of them bloody and breathing hard, surrounded by the wreckage of the lodge and the watching eyes of his wolves. "Bind her," he said to Hugo, who had appeared beside him with silver-reinforced restraints designed to prevent transformation. "And the others, take them alive, but ensure they cannot escape." The journey back to his fortress took 6 hours, Vera secured in the armored transport vehicle, silent and radiating fury that made the air feel electric with suppressed violence. Magnus rode in a separate vehicle, trying to understand the wrongness that had settled into his chest, the way his wolf paced and whined, and seemed to be fighting against him in ways it never had before. He had won, had captured his enemy, had removed a threat to his territory and his authority. But the victory felt hollow, tasted like ash and copper, like something fundamental had been damaged that he could not yet identify. They installed her in the lower compound cells, reinforced rooms designed to contain even the strongest wolves. But Magnus found himself ordering her moved to better quarters within hours, to a secured room in the fortress proper that had windows and furniture, and none of the degrading conditions typically reserved for prisoners. Hugo questioned the decision with his eyes, but not his words, and Magnus could not articulate his reasoning beyond the simple fact that the idea of her in the darkness made his wolf howl with distress. The first interrogation happened at midnight, Magnus entering her room to find her standing at the window, her back to him, her copper-red braid hanging down between her shoulder blades. She did not turn when he entered, did not acknowledge his presence except for the slight tensing of her shoulders. "Tell me about the night your pack died," he said, his voice emerging quieter than intended, almost gentle despite the context. She turned then, her forest green eyes meeting his with such concentrated pain that he felt it like a physical blow. "Why?" she asked. "So you can relive your victory? Can hear how thoroughly you destroyed everything I was before I became this?" "No," Magnus said, and realized he meant it. Realized that something in him needed to understand what had happened 7 years ago, needed to reconcile the grief in her eyes with the intelligence reports that had justified his actions. "Because I am beginning to suspect we are both victims of someone else's manipulation, and I need to know the truth." Vera studied him for a long moment, searching his face for deception, for ulterior motive. Then she began to speak, describing the night of fire and screaming, the systematic slaughter of wolves who had not even understood they were under attack until it was too late, the professional killers who had moved through their compound like ghosts, without pack scent or identifying marks. She described watching her father die, his final words a curse on Magnus Cold's name, an accusation of betrayal and murder for crimes the Western Coastal Pack had never committed. Magnus listened, his wolf growing increasingly agitated as details emerged that did not align with his understanding, that suggested a coordination and brutality beyond what he had authorized. He had ordered the execution of his sister's killers, had sanctioned military action against the pack that harbored them. But the picture Vera painted was not surgical strike, but wholesale massacre, was not justice, but genocide. "The dates," he said when she finished, his mind
and already working through the implications. "You said this happened on the autumn equinox, but my sister died 3 weeks before that, and I did not authorize military action until I had confirmed intelligence about her killer's location. The timing does not match." Vera's expression shifted, confusion cutting through the hatred for the first time. "Your sister died in autumn," she said slowly. "My pack was destroyed in autumn. How could you have confirmed anything in 3 weeks when you claim to have been investigating?" Magnus felt cold certainty sliding down his spine, felt the first real cracks forming in the narrative he had built his grief upon. "I did not investigate for 3 weeks," he said. "I investigated for 2 months before I received intelligence that placed your pack's war faction at the location where my sister was killed, that provided testimony from witnesses about Western coastal wolves bragging about their strike against the Cold bloodline." They stared at each other in the lamplight, both beginning to see the shape of something larger, something that had used their grief as weapons against each other, that had orchestrated their mutual destruction for purposes neither yet understood. Before Magnus could speak again, alarms shattered the night stillness, warning of a breach at the fortress's eastern perimeter. Hugo's voice came through his communication device, urgent and clipped, reporting that they were under attack by a strike force attempting to reach the detention area, attempting to rescue Vera Stone through military assault. It was Petra Flint who led the charge, Vera second, loyal enough to throw herself against impossible odds for a rescue attempt that had perhaps 5% chance of success. Magnus's forces repelled them within 20 minutes, capturing Petra along with 3 other wolves, killing 2 more who refused to surrender. He found Vera at her window, watching the aftermath, tears streaming down her face, her hands pressed against the glass like she could reach through it to protect the wolves who had followed her into this disaster. In that moment, seeing her grief reflected back as surely as if he were looking in a mirror, Magnus Cold understood that whatever lay between them was more complicated than enemy and captive, more dangerous than simple hatred, and that the truth they were beginning to uncover would reshape everything he thought he knew about justice, vengeance, and the 7-year-old night that had set them both on this collision course. The Alpha King made a new enemy, but he did not expect to fall in love with her. 7 days passed in a strange suspension of hostility, each one marked by conversations that began as interrogations and transformed into something closer to archaeological excavations of shared trauma, both of them digging through the ruins of the past, searching for foundations that might still be solid, might still support weight. Magnus had Vera move to quarters in the eastern wing, rooms that were technically still secured but felt less like imprisonment and more like protective custody, with furniture that did not belong in a cell and windows that opened onto the mountain vista beyond the fortress walls. He told himself this was strategic,
that a comfortable prisoner was more likely to provide useful information, but his wolf needed the truth even if his conscious mind refused to examine it too closely. The daily sessions happened in what had once been a library, a room filled with books about pack history and territorial law, and the kind of tactical manuals that Magnus had studied obsessively during his rise to power. They sat across from each other at a heavy oak table, the space between them charged with something that was not quite hostility anymore, but had not yet transformed into anything resembling trust. Vera spoke about her pack's final night with the precision of someone who had replayed the memories so many times they had taken on the quality of ritual, of testimony that needed to be preserved even if no one would hear it. The killers came at midnight, she said on the third day, her forest green eyes distant with remembering. They wore no colors, carried no pack scent beyond a chemical smell that burned the nose, moved with the kind of coordination that suggested military training far beyond what most packs maintain. They killed
The sentries first, so quietly that no alarm was raised until they were already inside the compound. My father was in his office when they reached him. I was supposed to be there too, was supposed to be learning territorial negotiations, but I had left 10 minutes earlier because Petra needed help with training exercises. Magnus listened, his tactical mind cataloging details that did not fit the profile of the wolves he had sent, the precision strike force he had authorized to eliminate specific targets identified through intelligence channels. You said they smelled chemical, he said. Describe that more specifically. Vera's brow furrowed with concentration, with the effort of retrieving sensory details through the filter of terror and grief. Like silver, she said slowly, but not quite silver. Sharper, more astringent, the way the air smells after lightning strikes. And something else underneath, something organic but wrong, like decay masked with antiseptic. I remember thinking, even in the chaos, that these wolves were not natural, that something about them had been altered or suppressed. Magnus felt cold certainty crystallizing in his chest, felt pieces of a pattern beginning to emerge that suggested sophistication beyond simple mercenary work. Silver-based scent suppressants had been experimental 7 years ago, had existed only in the black market territories, where wolves traded in resources that violated every pack law about natural order and biological integrity. He had heard rumors about their use, about wolves who could move through packlands undetected because the chemicals masked their identifying markers, but he had never encountered direct evidence of their deployment. My sister's body, he said, his voice rougher than he intended, carried the same scent. I did not understand what it meant at the time, attributed it to the location where she was found, near a stream that ran through an old mining operation. But if the same chemicals were present at both sites, if the killers used identical methods, then someone equipped them, Vera finished, her eyes meeting his with the first genuine connection they had shared, the first moment of unified purpose. Someone with resources and knowledge, and access to materials that should not exist outside specialized networks. Someone who wanted both our packs destroyed, and was willing to invest significant effort in making it happen. The implications spread outward like cracks in ice, threatening to shatter every assumption Magnus had built his grief and his vengeance upon. He spent the nights after these conversations in his private tower, staring at intelligence reports from 7 years ago, seeing them now through the lens of potential manipulation, rather than reliable evidence. The witnesses who had placed Western coastal wolves at his sister's murder site had been rogues, wolves with no permanent pack affiliation, and therefore no way to verify their claims. The physical evidence had been circumstantial, suggestive rather than conclusive. He had wanted so desperately to make someone pay for his sister's death, that he had accepted a narrative that confirmed his rage, rather than questioning its foundations. On the 5th day, Hugo entered the library during one of their sessions, his expression carrying the particular tension that meant he brought information Magnus would not want to hear. There is someone at the gates, Hugo said, his steel-gray eyes moving between Magnus and Vera with calculation. Counselor Wilhelm Gray, from the neutral territories. He claims to have information relevant to both of you, claims it cannot wait for formal diplomatic channels. Magnus felt his wolf stir with warning, with the instinctive understanding that whatever Wilhelm brought would change trajectories that were already shifting in dangerous directions. The counselor was old, had served as neutral arbiter for territorial disputes since before Magnus was born, carried the kind of authority that came from outliving 3 generations of alphas, and maintaining absolute impartiality through decades of political upheaval. If Wilhelm had traveled through Winter Mountains to reach the fortress personally, the information he carried was significant enough to risk his life on frozen roads and through territories that did not always respect neutral status. Bring him to the formal receiving Room, Magnus said, then looked at Vera. You will attend this meeting. Whatever he knows, you have as much right to hear it as I do." Something shifted in Vera's expression, something that might have been surprise, or might have been the first tentative acknowledgement that Magnus was treating her as something other than prisoner or enemy. She nodded once, rising from her chair with the grace that never failed to make his wolf pay attention, in ways that had nothing to do with tactical assessment, and everything to do with responses he still could not name. Petra Flint remained in the cells below, her loyalty to Vera absolute enough that Magnus had not yet determined whether she represented asset or liability. He had allowed Vera to visit her second on the fourth day, had watched through security monitors as the two women spoke in low voices, as Petra's amber eyes studied Vera with the particular intensity of someone looking for signs of coercion or manipulation. The visit had ended with Petra seemingly satisfied that Vera remained unharmed, and Vera emerging with an expression that suggested her second had told her things she had not wanted to hear, had perhaps identified truths Vera herself was still resisting. Wilhelm Grey looked every one of his 68 years, his white hair worn long in the old style, his body supporting itself with a carved walking stick that was probably as much weapon as aid, his milky blue eyes carrying the particular sharpness of someone whose other senses had compensated for failing vision. He bowed to Magnus with the minimum respect protocol required, then turned to Vera with the same gesture, treating captive and captor as political equals in a way that would have infuriated Magnus a week ago, but now felt almost appropriate. "Alpha King," Wilhelm said, his voice carrying the particular cadence of formal speech. "Stone Heir, I come bearing information that concerns you both. Information I should perhaps have brought forward years ago, but did not, because I lacked proof sufficient to challenge an Alpha King's justice. I have that proof now, purchased at great cost from sources who will not survive the telling, and I believe it will reshape your understanding of the events that set you on this path toward mutual destruction." Magnus felt Vera tense beside him, felt the way her breathing changed, shallow and quick, the physiological response to hope that had been beaten down so many times it had learned to manifest as fear. "Speak," he said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to obedience, but gentler than usual, aware that whatever came next would hurt them both in ways that combat never could. Wilhelm reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, aged and worn, containing documents and photographs and what appeared to be testimony transcribed in multiple hands. "The wolves who killed your sister," Magnus called, "were not from the Western Coastal Pack," Wilhelm said. "They were mercenaries hired by a rogue alpha named Victor Sorensen, who controls territory in the far northeast, in the frozen wastelands most packs consider uninhabitable and therefore beneath notice. Victor has spent 2 decades destabilizing neighboring territories through precisely this method, creating conflicts between packs that would normally coexist peacefully, waiting for them to weaken each other before moving in to claim the power vacuum." He spread photographs across the table, images of wolves in various states of transformation, each marked with identification numbers and dates. "These are Victor's known operatives," Wilhelm continued. "Some of them appear in intelligence reports from both the night of your sister's death and the night of the Western Coastal Pack's destruction. Same wolves, same methods, same chemical scent suppressants that mask pack affiliation. Victor equipped them, trained them, deployed them with surgical precision to create the exact outcome that occurred. You destroying a pack that had nothing to do with your sister's murder. That pack's heir swearing vengeance against you. Both of you so consumed by grief and rage that you never questioned the narrative placed before you." Magnus stared at the photographs, at faces he recognized from his own intelligence files, from the reports he had studied obsessively in the aftermath of his sister's death. But these
same faces appeared in other contexts, in other operations, in a pattern that suggested systematic manipulation spanning years. His wolf howled with rage and grief, with the understanding that he had been used, that his sister's death had been just one move in a game he had not known he was playing. Beside him, Vera made a sound that was not quite a sob, her hand reaching out to grip the table's edge hard enough that her knuckles went white. "My father," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "You are telling me my father died for nothing? That everyone I loved was murdered not because of anything they did, but because some monster wanted to use their deaths as a weapon against this man?" Wilhelm's expression carried genuine sorrow, genuine regret for truths that destroyed rather than healed. "I am sorry," he said simply. "I am sorry it took so long to gather this evidence, sorry that I could not prevent what happened between you. But Victor Sorensen moves again, prepares another strike against weakened territories, and if you do not set aside your hatred and work together, he will destroy you both as surely as he destroyed your families." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush,
felt like the weight of 7 years of misdirected vengeance pressing down on them both until breathing became difficult. Magnus looked at Vera, saw his own devastation reflected in her forest green eyes, saw the way her carefully constructed purpose had just been revealed as manipulation, as someone else's weapon turned against an innocent target. He wanted to say something, wanted to offer comfort or apology or acknowledgement of the horror they had both just learned, but words felt inadequate, felt too small to contain the magnitude of what had been taken from them. So instead, he did something his wolf had been demanding for days, something that made no tactical sense, but felt necessary in a way that transcended strategy. He reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers closing around hers, and she did not pull away, did not reject the contact, even though every reason she had for hating him still existed, still mattered, had simply been recontextualized as someone else's crime rather than his intentional cruelty. They sat that way while Wilhelm continued to present evidence, while Hugo entered to review the documents with his strategic mind, while the full scope of Victor's manipulations became clear in ways that suggested a predator far more dangerous than either of them had understood. And through it all, Magnus felt something shifting between himself and the woman whose life he had destroyed, whose grief matched his own, whose hand remained in his like an anchor against the tide of revelation threatening to sweep them both away into madness or despair. The Alpha King made a new enemy, but he did not expect to fall in love with her. The documents spread across the war room table like evidence of a crime too large to comprehend in a single viewing. Each piece of testimony and surveillance photograph and financial record, another brick in the foundation of a conspiracy that had consumed 7 years of their lives and countless innocent deaths. Magnus stood at the head of the table with Wilhelm on his right and Hugo on his left, while Vera occupied the space directly across from him, her copper-red braid hanging over one shoulder, her forest-green eyes moving across the evidence with the particular intensity of someone memorizing every detail, every name, every date that proved her entire understanding of the world had been built on manufactured lies. Victor Sorensen had been patient in ways that suggested either supreme confidence or genuine madness, had spent decades building his northeastern territory into something that existed outside normal pack governance, that operated according to rules he had written specifically to facilitate the kind of long-term manipulation that required resources and ruthlessness in equal measure. The financial records Wilhelm had obtained, purchased from a dying wolf who had worked in Victor's trafficking operations, showed money flowing through shell companies and black market channels, funding everything from scent suppressant development to mercenary recruitment to information brokering that allowed Victor to identify packs vulnerable to destabilization. The Western Coastal Pack,
Cat had been targeted not because of anything they had done, but because their territory bordered Magnus's, because their destruction would either weaken the Alpha King through guilt and political fallout, or strengthen him through the elimination of potential rivals, and either outcome served Victor's long-term strategy of creating power vacuums he could eventually fill. Magnus's sister had been killed specifically to provoke the response that followed, her death calculated to generate enough rage that Magnus would not question the intelligence placing blame on the Western Coastal Pack's war faction. Vera's hand trembled slightly as she lifted a photograph of her father, taken perhaps a month before his death, showing him in formal pack regalia at some territorial gathering. He believed in cooperation, she said, her voice emerging quiet but steady despite the visible effort it required. He argued constantly with the war faction about their aggressive posturing toward your borders, tried to negotiate peaceful resolutions to disputes that could have escalated. That is why I never understood why you claimed he harbored your sister's killers. My father would have turned them over immediately if he had known, would have demanded their execution himself to preserve pack honor. Magnus felt the familiar weight of guilt settling deeper into his chest, the understanding that his grief-driven vengeance had accomplished exactly what Victor intended, had made him complicit in genocide, even though he had believed himself to be pursuing justice. I accepted the intelligence because I needed someone to blame, he said, and the admission cost him something, required him to speak a truth he had not fully acknowledged even to himself. My sister was the only family I had left, the only person who knew me before I became this, before I transformed myself into something capable of ruling through fear and absolute control. When she died, something in me broke, and I wanted the world to hurt the way I was hurting. Victor understood that, weaponized it, turned my grief into a tool for destroying innocence. The silence that followed carried weight, carried the acknowledgement of damage that could not be undone, of deaths that could not be avenged, because the true architect of their suffering had remained hidden while they tore each other apart. Wilhelm shifted his weight, his walking stick tapping against the stone floor with deliberate rhythm, drawing their attention back to the evidence, to the tactical reality that Victor's manipulations had not ended with their mutual destruction, but continued into the present. "Victor moves again," Wilhelm said, his milky blue eyes somehow still conveying the sharpness of his observation, the decades of experience reading political currents and power dynamics. "My sources indicate he is gathering forces for a major offensive, has been recruiting mercenaries and displaced wolves for months, building towards something larger than his previous operations. He knows by now that his manipulation has been exposed, that you have been meeting these past days, and he will accelerate his timeline accordingly. If I had to estimate, I would say you have perhaps 2 weeks before he strikes, possibly less." Hugo leaned forward, his steel-gray eye scanning the territorial maps Wilhelm had brought, the markings indicating Victor's known holdings and probable resource networks. "His territory is vast, but supposedly underpopulated, considered wasteland by most pack standards," Hugo said. "How has he maintained military force sufficient to threaten an Alpha King without drawing attention from the Council or neighboring territories?" Wilhelm's expression suggested he had been waiting for precisely this question, had perhaps structured his presentation specifically to lead them toward this realization. Because Victor does not maintain traditional pack structure, does not declare his wolves or register them with the Council, keeps his operations compartmentalized and hidden behind layers of shell companies and black market channels. He has transformed his territory into something closer to a criminal empire than a wolf pack, trading in supernatural resources that most packs consider taboo, weapons and drugs and information that he sells to anyone willing to pay. His wealth is substantial, his connections extensive, and his willingness to operate outside every law that governs our society gives him advantages that honorable alphas cannot match. Magnus felt his wolf stir with recognition, with the understanding that Victor represented everything he had spent 11 years trying to eliminate from his territories, the chaos and violence and exploitation that thrived in the spaces between pack law and human society. He had consolidated his power specifically to create order, to establish systems that protected vulnerable wolves from exactly the kind of predation Victor embodied, and now he faced an enemy who had studied those systems specifically to identify their weaknesses, their points of failure. Vera stood abruptly, her chair scraping against stone, her body vibrating with tension that suggested she was fighting the urge to transform, to channel her rage into something physical and immediate. "You want us to work together," she said, her eyes moving between Wilhelm and Magnus. "You want me to fight alongside the man who destroyed my pack, who killed my father, regardless of the fact that he believed himself justified. You want me to set aside 7 years of grief and rage and planning because we have a common enemy who manipulated us both." Wilhelm met her gaze without flinching, his ancient authority enough to stand against even her fury. "I want you to survive," he said simply. "I want you to honor your dead by living, by preventing Victor from using their deaths to destroy more innocents. Your father would not want his legacy to be your death in service of vengeance against the wrong target. He would want you to fight the true enemy, to prevent others from suffering what your pack suffered." Vera's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her whole body trembling now with the effort of containing transformation, containing the wolf that wanted to tear something apart to release the pressure building in her chest. Magnus watched her struggle, recognized it because he had lived it himself in the days after his sister's death, that particular torture of grief that had no acceptable outlet, that could not be satisfied through violence or justice or any action available to the living. He moved around the table before his tactical mind could interfere, before strategy could override instinct, closing the distance between them until he stood close enough to feel the heat radiating from her skin, to smell the particular combination of rage and sorrow that colored her scent. His wolf pushed forward, demanding, insistent in ways that finally made terrible sense, that clicked into place with the force of revelation that should have been obvious days ago, but had been obscured by grief and guilt and the sheer impossibility of the timing. "The mate bond," Magnus said, his voice low enough that only Vera could hear, rough with the understanding that was still crystallizing in his mind. "That is why my wolf would not kill you in the ravine, why I cannot stand the thought of you in pain, why every instinct I have screams at me to protect you, even though you have every right to want me dead. The universe or fate or whatever force governs these things looked at the two of us, at our shared trauma and manufactured hatred, and decided we were meant to be bound together." Vera's eyes went wide, her breath catching, and he saw the moment she understood, saw recognition and denial and desperate hope flash across her features in rapid succession. No, she said, but the word emerged without conviction, without the certainty that would have made it true. That is not possible, cannot be possible, because I have spent 7 years hating you, building my entire existence around destroying you, and the bond does not work that way, does not force itself on people who are fundamentally incompatible. But even as she spoke, Magnus saw her hand rise unconsciously to her chest, saw the way she swayed slightly toward him despite her words, saw her wolf rising in her eyes with the same confused longing his own wolf had been broadcasting for days. The bond did not care about compatibility or timing, or the damage they had done to each other, did not take into account that he had destroyed her family, and she had declared war on his territory, recognized only that somewhere in their genetic makeup and supernatural essence, they matched in ways that transcended conscious choice or rational
objection. Hugo cleared his throat deliberately, breaking the moment, his expression carrying something that might have been sympathy or might have been tactical calculation. We should discuss defensive preparations, he said. Regardless of personal complications, Victor represents an immediate threat that requires coordinated response. Magnus forced himself to step back, to create physical distance even though his wolf howled protest, to return his attention to the strategic problem even though every instinct demanded he deal with the emotional crisis first. You are right, he said, his voice emerging more controlled than he felt. Wilhelm, I need everything you have on Victor's known operations, his supply chains, his recruitment methods. Hugo, begin recall of our scattered patrols. Consolidate forces for fortress defense. And Vera, he turned to face her directly, meeting her still shocked gaze. I am releasing you and Petra from custody unconditionally. You are free to leave, to return to your network, to walk away from this entirely. But I am asking, not as an alpha king to a subordinate, but as one wolf to another, that you consider staying, that you help me fight the enemy who destroyed both our families. Vera stared at him for a long moment, her forest green eyes searching his face for deception, for manipulation, for any indication that this was another trap disguised as opportunity. Then she looked at Wilhelm, at Hugo, at the evidence spread across the table that proved Victor's guilt and their mutual victimhood. When she spoke, her voice carried exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue, that suggested years of carrying weight that had just been revealed as unnecessary, as someone else's burden placed on her shoulders through deception. I need to see Petra, she said. I need to tell her what we learned, need her counsel before I make any decisions about alliance with the man who has been my enemy for 7 years. And then, if I choose to stay, if I choose to fight beside you against Victor, we will need to address this bond you claim exists between us, because I will not be manipulated by biology any more than I will be manipulated by grief or rage, or any other force that tries to control my choices. Magnus nodded once, sharp and definite, recognizing the strength it required for her to demand space and time when everything in her probably wanted immediate resolution, immediate answers to questions that had just been reframed in ways that shattered her understanding of herself and her purpose. Hugo will escort you to Petra's location, he said. Take whatever time you need. Victor will not strike tonight, and whatever happens next needs to be your choice, not my command or the bond's compulsion. He watched her leave with Hugo, watched the way she moved like someone his foundations had just been revealed as quicksand, uncertain but still graceful, still dangerous, still utterly captivating in ways that had nothing to do with the mate bond, and everything to do with who she was beneath the grief and rage that had defined her for so long. Wilhelm remained behind, his milky blue eyes somehow seeing directly into the chaos of Magnus's thoughts. You love her, the old wolf observed. Not a question, but a statement of fact delivered with the certainty of someone who had witnessed countless generations fall victim to the particular madness of mate bonds. Not because the bond demands it, but because of who she is, how she survived, what she built from the ashes of everything you took from her. That is what will make this so much harder, Alpha King. The bond would be simpler, would be easier to dismiss as biology, but genuine love requires you to accept that you destroyed the life of the person you care for most, and that she would be entirely justified in never forgiving you regardless of Victor's manipulations. Magnus closed his eyes, feeling the truth of those words settling into his bones like frost, like the particular cold that came not from temperature, but from understanding exactly how much damage could not be undone, how many deaths could not be avenged, how thoroughly he had failed the person fate had chosen as his perfect match. The Alpha King made a new enemy, but he did not expect to fall in love with her. 3 days passed in the strange liminal space between alliance and separation, Vera remaining in the fortress not as prisoner, but as something undefined, not quite guest and not quite equal,
Occupying rooms Magnus had assigned her in the western wing, where morning light came through the windows in gold-tinted streams that reminded him painfully of her eyes when sunlight caught them at certain angles. She did not leave, despite his explicit permission to do so, despite the fact that Petra had been released, and stood ready to escort her back to whatever remained of her rogue network after weeks of disrupted leadership. Instead, she stayed, claiming through Hugo that she needed to review Wilhelm's evidence more thoroughly, that strategic planning against Victor required her complete understanding of his operations and methods. Magnus knew she was lying, knew she stayed because the mate bond had begun asserting itself with increasing intensity now that both of them had recognized it, now that the secret had been spoken aloud and could no longer be dismissed as unexplained instinct or tactical distraction. He felt her presence in the fortress like a magnetic pull, always aware of her location even when walls and distance separated them, his wolf restless and demanding whenever more than a few hours passed without seeing her. The bond was not complete, would not be complete unless they both chose to finalize it through the ancient rituals that transformed biological compatibility into permanent spiritual and physical connection. But even incomplete, it exerted pressure that made concentration difficult and sleep nearly impossible. On the fourth morning, he found her in the training yard, moving through combat forms with Petra, while a dozen of his wolves watched from the perimeter, their expressions carrying the particular calculation of warriors assessing potential threat or potential ally. Vera fought with devastating efficiency, her movements precise and economical, wasting no energy on flourishes or intimidation displays, every strike designed to disable or kill with minimum effort. She had been trained well, had clearly spent years honing skills that went far beyond basic pack defense, and Magnus felt unwilling pride watching her disarm Petra in a sequence so fast his eyes barely tracked the individual movements. She sensed his presence before he spoke, her head turning to pin him with forest green eyes that still carried wariness despite 4 days of cautious coexistence, despite the evidence that had reframed their entire relationship. Her wolf recognized him immediately, rose in her gaze with longing she could not fully suppress, and his own wolf responded with the kind of possessive satisfaction that would have alarmed him a week ago, but now felt inevitable, felt like the only honest reaction available. "Your technique is exceptional," Magnus said, moving into the yard with deliberate casualness, aware of how his presence changed the atmosphere, how his wolves immediately straightened and increased their attention. "Where did you train? Because that level of skill does not develop from standard pack instruction." Vera's expression shifted, something that might have been bitter amusement crossing her features. "My father insisted I learn tactical combat from childhood," she said, her voice carrying the particular tone of memory that hurt even in recall. He believed the Western Coastal Pack needed leaders who could fight as well as negotiate, who understood violence intimately enough to know when to deploy it and when to seek alternative solutions. After he died, after I became a rogue, those skills were the only reason I survived the first year. You learn very quickly to be efficient when you are alone, and every other wolf views you as either threat or prey. The words carried accusation, even though her tone remained neutral, carried the implicit understanding that her years of brutal survival existed in direct line of causation from his actions, from his failure to verify intelligence before sanctioning genocide. Magnus felt the guilt like a physical weight, like something pressing against his chest hard enough to restrict breathing, but he did not look away from her gaze, did not allow himself the comfort of avoiding her pain. "I cannot undo what I did to your pack," he said quietly, pitched for her ears alone, even though everyone in the yard could probably hear with enhanced wolf senses. "I cannot restore." Restore your father, or the life you should have had, or the 7 years you spent building purpose from grief I caused. But I can ensure Victor pays for manipulating us both, can help you achieve vengeance against the true architect of your suffering. And after that, if you still want to destroy me, I will not stand in your way." Something flickered in Vera's expression, something complicated and painful, that suggested she was fighting battles inside herself that had nothing to do with combat technique or tactical preparation. Then Petra stepped forward, her amber eyes moving between them with the particular knowing that came from long friendship and careful observation. And Magnus recognized that Vera's second had already identified the mate bond, had probably named it before either of them had fully understood what they were experiencing. "If we are going to fight together against Victor," Petra said, her voice carrying the no-nonsense practicality of someone who dealt in reality rather than emotional complexity, "then we need to establish clear command structure and communication protocols. Vera's network operates differently than pack hierarchy, uses consensus and tactical flexibility rather than absolute authority. Your forces are accustomed to following orders without question, without room for individual initiative. Those approaches will conflict in combat unless we address the differences now." Hugo appeared at Magnus's shoulder, as if summoned, his presence a grounding counterweight to the tension vibrating between Magnus and Vera. "Petra is correct," Hugo said. "We should convene a strategic council, combine our tactical knowledge with Vera's intelligence about rogue operations and displaced wolf networks. Victor will expect us to fight as separate forces. We'll have planned his assault assuming we cannot coordinate effectively. Proving him wrong requires integration at every level, not just leadership." The hours that followed transformed into exactly the kind of meticulous planning Magnus excelled at, the careful construction of defensive strategies and contingency protocols that accounted for variables and maximized available resources. They worked in the war room with maps and force assessments spread across every available surface, Vera's tactical mind proving as sharp as her combat skills, her ability to think 3 moves ahead matching his own strategic instincts in ways that created a collaborative efficiency Magnus had never experienced before. Hugo and Petra developed their own rapport, their approaches complementary despite coming from radically different pack philosophies, building toward integration that felt more organic than forced. Night fell while they worked, darkness pressing against the windows, and Magnus called a pause when he noticed Vera's exhaustion, despite her attempts to hide it, the way her shoulders had begun to tighten and her responses had grown marginally slower. The others filed out with varying degrees of reluctance, Hugo shooting him a look that carried entirely too much knowing, entirely too much awareness that Magnus was creating opportunity for private conversation that had nothing to do with tactical planning. Vera remained at the table, her fingers tracing patrol routes on the northern approach map, her expression distant in the way that suggested she was fighting against the mate bond's pull, against the biological imperative that intensified with proximity and privacy. Magnus crossed to the room's far side, maintaining distance he suspected they both needed, pouring water from the pitcher kept on the sideboard and bringing her a glass without comment. She accepted it with a nod that might have been gratitude or might have been simple acknowledgement, drinking deeply before setting the glass aside and finally meeting his gaze directly. "Your beta suspects the bond," she said, not quite a question. "Petra confirmed it yesterday after spending an hour cataloging my symptoms and comparing them to mate bond literature she apparently memorized years ago. She believes I am being foolish for resisting something biology has determined is inevitable." Magnus felt his wolf surge with hope at the implicit acknowledgement, at the confirmation that Vera had been experiencing the same pull, the same impossible longing. But he forced himself to respond carefully, to honor the autonomy he had demanded. "The bond does not care about timing or circumstance or damage," he said. "It simply is, exists whether we want it or not, whether it makes sense or destroys us. But Petra is wrong if she believes it is inevitable, because you always have choice. The bond can remain incomplete indefinitely if you choose not to finalize it, can exist as permanent frustration rather than fulfillment. I will not pressure you toward acceptance simply because my wolf demands it, because I want it more than I have wanted anything in years." Vera's eyes widened slightly at the admission, at the raw honesty he had not intended to voice but could not seem to suppress in her presence. She stood slowly, moving around the table toward him with predatory grace that made his wolf take notice, despite the exhaustion evident in the lines of her body, in the way she held herself like someone expecting attack from any direction. "I hate that this exists between us," she said, stopping close enough that he could smell the particular combination of exertion and tension that colored her scent. "I hate that my wolf recognizes you as mate, when my mind knows you as the person who destroyed everything I was before I became this. I hate that I cannot make myself leave despite every reason I have to walk away and never think of you again. Most of all, I hate that some part of me, the part that is not entirely consumed by grief and rage, wants to know what you would be like if we had met differently, if our introduction had not been written in the blood of everyone I loved." Magnus held himself absolutely still, every instinct demanding he close the remaining distance, that he touch her, that he claim what the bond insisted belonged to him. But he had taken enough from her through ignorance and grief-driven vengeance, had destroyed enough of her choices, and he would not take this too, would not allow biology to override her autonomy regardless of what it cost him. "Then let us survive Victor first," he said, his voice emerging rougher than intended, strained with the effort of restraint. "Let us achieve the vengeance you are owed against the true enemy, and after that, when the immediate threat is past, we can address what exists between us with clear minds unclouded by tactical necessity. I can give you that much at least, can give you time and space to make a choice that is actually yours, rather than circumstance forcing your hand." Vera studied him for a long moment, her forest green eyes searching his face for deception, for manipulation, for any indication that his words were strategy rather than genuine offer. Then she nodded once, sharp and decisive, and stepped back, creating physical distance that did nothing to reduce the mate bond's insistent pull, but provided the illusion of control they both apparently needed. The attack came at dawn 2 days later, Victor's forces hitting the fortress with the kind of overwhelming numbers that suggested he had been planning this assault for months, had perhaps always intended to strike at Magnus regardless of whether the manipulation with Vera's pack succeeded. The perimeter alarms shattered the pre-dawn quiet, followed immediately by the sounds of combat as sentries engaged enemy wolves pouring through the forest approaches on 3 sides simultaneously, coordinated to overwhelm defensive positions and create chaos that would prevent organized response. Magnus transformed before he reached the courtyard, his massive platinum-furred wolf form designed for exactly this kind of combat, built for dominance and devastating force. He hit the first wave of attackers with brutal efficiency, his size and strength allowing him to tear through wolves that would have challenged lesser alphas, his tactical mind tracking battlefield developments even as his body executed kills with mechanical precision. Then he saw Vera entering the fight from the eastern approach, her copper-red wolf form smaller but impossibly fast, moving through enemy formations like a blade through silk, and his wolf responded to her presence with a surge of possessive satisfaction that translated into increased ferocity. They had not planned to fight together, had not practiced coordination, but the mate bond created instinctive synchronization that required no conscious communication, each of them moving to cover the other's vulnerabilities.
Babies without discussion or hesitation. An enemy wolf, larger and darker than the mercenaries surrounding it, broke through the defensive line and launched itself at Magnus from his blind side, jaws open for the killing strike to his throat. Magnus turned too slowly, his previous kill still occupying his momentum, and in the fractional second before impact he recognized that he had made a tactical error that would probably cost him his life. Then Vera was there, intercepting the strike meant for him, her smaller body absorbing the impact, and the enemy's fangs sinking deep into her shoulder instead of his throat. The scent of her blood hit Magnus's senses like physical blow, triggered a response so primal and overwhelming that conscious thought disappeared entirely, leaving only the wolf and its rage, and the absolute imperative to destroy anything that threatened its mate. What followed existed outside rational description, outside the normal parameters of combat. Magnus's wolf unleashing the full weight of alpha dominance without restraint or control, tearing through Victor's forces with such savage efficiency that wolves began retreating despite numerical advantage, their instincts screaming that they faced something beyond normal pack hierarchy, something that would kill them all if they did not flee immediately. The enemy withdrew within minutes, their assault broken not by defensive strategy but by sheer overwhelming force, by an alpha king who had just discovered exactly how far past civilized behavior his wolf would go to protect its mate. Magnus shifted back to human form beside Vera's unconscious wolf, his hands shaking as he gathered her carefully, as he carried her toward the fortress with Petra and Hugo clearing path through the battlefield debris, and his mind could form only one coherent thought through the chaos of terror and rage still consuming him. He could not lose her, could not survive losing someone else to violence and political maneuvering, could not endure watching the mate bond snap before it had even been properly acknowledged, and that understanding carried implications he was not ready to examine but could no longer deny. The Alpha King made a new enemy, but he did not expect to fall in love with her. Vera woke to pain that felt like fire burning through her shoulder and down her left side, to the distinctive smell of healing herbs and antiseptic that meant someone had been tending her injuries with the kind of meticulous care usually reserved for high-value assets or deeply loved family members. She opened her eyes slowly, vision adjusting to the dim light filtering through heavy curtains, and recognized Magnus's private quarters immediately from the particular combination of his scent saturating every surface and the austere furnishings that spoke of someone who viewed rooms as functional spaces rather than homes requiring personalization. Magnus himself sat in a chair pulled close to the bed, his platinum hair disheveled in ways she had never seen before, his pale golden eyes carrying shadows that suggested he had not slept since the battle. He wore clean clothes, but she could still smell blood on him, could detect the lingering traces of violence and terror that clung to his skin despite obvious attempts to wash them away. The moment her eyes opened, his entire body tensed, leaning forward with intensity that would have been frightening if her wolf had not immediately responded with contentment, with the bone-deep satisfaction of waking to find one's mate nearby and vigilant. "You should not have taken that strike," Magnus said. His voice emerged rough and strained, carrying barely controlled emotion that contradicted his usual careful neutrality. "You should have let me handle my own defensive failures instead of throwing yourself into harm's way for someone who destroyed your pack, who gave you every reason to hope I died in that battle." Vera tried to sit up, managed to lever herself partially upright before the pain forced her to abandon the attempt, settling for turning her head to meet his gaze more directly.
How long? She asked, her throat dry enough that the words emerged as a rasp rather than proper speech. 4 days, Magnus said, and something in his expression suggested those 4 days had cost him in ways that went beyond tactical concern or political calculation. The healers.
Leller said the bite missed major arteries, but caused significant muscle damage that required constant monitoring to prevent infection. You have been unconscious, except for brief periods where you surfaced enough to take water and medication before slipping back under. I have been, he paused, searching for words, unable to leave this room for longer than necessary to receive tactical updates and issue orders. The admission hung between them, weighted with implication, with the acknowledgement that the mate bond had progressed far enough that separation caused him genuine distress, that her injury had triggered protective responses he apparently could not control, even when rational thought suggested he should maintain appropriate distance. Vera felt her own wolf stirring with satisfaction at this evidence of his devotion, felt the traitorous warmth spreading through her chest, despite every logical reason she had to resist the bond's influence. Petra appeared in the doorway as if summoned by Vera's consciousness returning, her amber eyes moving between them with the particular knowing that had always characterized her observations, the way she saw through pretense and political maneuvering to identify emotional truth neither party wanted to acknowledge aloud. She crossed to the bed with the easy familiarity of long friendship, checking Vera's injuries with gentle efficiency before stepping back with expression that carried both relief and exasperation. "You are an idiot," Petra said without preamble, her tone carrying affection despite the harsh words. "Throwing yourself in front of an alpha king who can handle his own defense, nearly dying to protect a mate bond you claim to resist, making this poor man sit vigil for 4 days watching you barely breathe, all trying to simultaneously coordinate fortress defense and plan counteroffensive against Victor's main force? Very dramatic, very romantic, very stupid." Vera felt heat rising in her cheeks, felt embarrassment and denial warring with the truth she could no longer avoid. "I acted on instinct," she said, but the excuse sounded weak, even to her own ears. "My wolf moved before my mind could process the threat, before I made conscious choice to intervene." Petra's expression suggested she did not believe this explanation for a moment, suggested she saw the intervention for exactly what it was, acceptance of the mate bond manifesting through action, even while Vera's conscious mind still fought against emotional acknowledgement. But her second was wise enough not to press the point directly, instead turning to Magnus with assessment that carried both challenge and tentative approval. "Hugo says Victor's assault was probing attack rather than full offensive," Petra said, shifting into tactical mode with practice ease. "He tested your defenses, measured response time and coordination, retreated before committing his main forces because the Alpha King's reaction to Vera's injury was apparently terrifying enough to convince even mercenary wolves that continued engagement would result in wholesale slaughter. Intelligence suggests Victor was not expecting mate bond complications, did not account for how that would affect Magnus's combat effectiveness or willingness to deploy lethal force without restraint." Magnus's expression tightened at this assessment, at the implication that his loss of control had been visible enough to become a tactical factor in enemy calculations. "I was not aware my behavior during the battle had been so transparent," he said, his voice carrying edge of self-recrimination. "You went feral," Petra said bluntly. "Full dominant alpha, protecting injured mate. No control, no restraint, just pure instinct and violence. Half your own wolves were afraid to approach you afterward. Hugo had to coordinate the defensive restructuring himself because you were functionally unavailable for command decisions, too focused on getting Vera to safety and ensuring she received immediate treatment." The silence that followed this revelation felt heavy, felt like the weight of truth neither Magnus nor Vera wanted to confront directly, but could no longer avoid through strategic deflection or emotional denial. Vera looked at Magnus, at the exhaustion evident in every line of his body, at the way his hands gripped the chair's arms hard enough to make the wood creak, and felt something shift. A shift inside her chest, some internal resistance cracking under the pressure of accumulated evidence that he cared for her not because biology demanded it, but because of who she was, what she represented, how she had survived everything he had taken from her. "The mate bond is affecting both of us more than I wanted to admit," Vera said quietly, the words emerging with difficulty, each one costing her something to speak aloud. "My wolf recognized you from our first confrontation, has been pulling me toward you despite every rational objection my mind could generate. I told myself it was just biology, just instinct that could be controlled through conscious choice and disciplined resistance. But when I saw that enemy wolf targeting you,
When I understood in that fractional second that you might die, something in me broke, decided without consultation that I would rather take the strike myself than watch you fall. Magnus's pale gold eyes held hers with intensity that made breathing difficult, made the room feel smaller and warmer, despite the space and cool temperature. I cannot offer you the life you should have had, he said, his voice low and rough with emotion he was no longer trying to suppress. I cannot restore your pack or your father, or the years you spent surviving in wilderness that should never have been your home. But I can promise that if you choose to accept this bond, if you choose to build something with me from the wreckage of what I destroyed, I will spend every remaining day of my existence trying to be worthy of that choice, trying to create future that honors your past, rather than demanding you forget it. The words hung in the air between them, confession and offer and acknowledgement, all combined into declaration that required response, that demanded she make a choice about not just the mate bond, but about forgiveness, about whether love and grief could coexist, whether she could build life with the person who had destroyed her previous existence, even knowing he had been manipulated into that destruction. Before Vera could respond, Hugo entered with Wilhelm close behind, both carrying expressions that suggested tactical situation had evolved in ways requiring immediate attention. Victor has sent formal challenge, Hugo said without preamble, holding out a document sealed with wax and marked with symbols that predated modern pack law by centuries. He invokes ancient right of territorial conquest through single combat, offers to settle the conflict through direct confrontation between alphas, rather than continued warfare that damages both forces. The challenge is addressed to Magnus, but specifies that it concerns grievances against both the Northern Territory and the displaced Western Coastal Pack survivors. Wilhelm's milky blue eyes moved between Magnus and Vera with the particular assessment of someone calculating political implications and strategic ramifications simultaneously. This is trap, the old counselor said. Victor knows about the mate bond by now, knows that Magnus will be compromised fighting alone while worrying about Vera's safety. He structures the challenge to isolate Magnus from his strongest tactical advantage, from the coordination and synchronization you demonstrated during the first assault. If Magnus accepts and fights alone, Victor will exploit every vulnerability. If Magnus refuses, Victor will use that refusal as justification to attack with full force, will claim the Alpha King hides behind pack strength rather than defending his territory with personal honor. Magnus stood slowly, his body unfolding with the predatory grace that never fully disappeared regardless of his emotional state, moving to examine the challenge document with expression that suggested he was already calculating angles and contingencies. The challenge specifies neutral ground, he said after several moments of silence. Old territorial boundary between the northeastern wastes and the mountain approaches, location that belongs to neither of us under current pack law. Single combat, alpha against alpha, with seconds present to ensure fairness but prohibited from intervention unless rules are violated. He looked up, his pale gold eyes meeting Vera's with question and vulnerability and hope all tangled together. Victor does not expect me to have a second, he said. He assumes I will fight alone because I
Trust no one sufficiently to stand beside me in formal challenge, because my authority has always been solitary, absolute, without the kind of partnership that would allow shared combat. But if you were to stand as my second, if we were to face him together as acknowledged mates and tactical partners, we would have advantage he cannot have prepared for, coordination he cannot counter because he does not understand what exists between us. Vera felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the weight of the choice he was offering, the implicit acknowledgement that accepting this role meant accepting the bond, meant making public declaration that they stood together not just as tactical allies, but as something deeper, something that transcended their manufactured enmity. Petra moved to her side, helped her sit up more fully despite the pain that lanced through her shoulder, and Vera saw approval in her second's expression, saw confirmation that this was the right choice, even if it meant abandoning 7 years of grief-driven purpose. I will stand with you, Vera said, the words emerging steady despite the fear and uncertainty churning in her chest. Not because the bond demands it, and not because I have forgiven you for what you took from me, but because Victor deserves to face us both, deserves to understand that his manipulations failed to destroy us the way he intended. After we kill him, after we achieve the vengeance my pack is owed,
Then we can address what exists between us without the weight of tactical necessity forcing premature resolution. Magnus's expression transformed, some of the shadows lifting from his eyes, some of the tension releasing from his shoulders. Then we have 6 days to prepare, he said, turning to Hugo and Wilhelm. 6 days to heal, to train, to develop coordination that will allow us to fight as single unit against an enemy who has spent decades perfecting his combat technique. Victor believes he has isolated me, believes he has created conditions that guarantee his victory. Let us demonstrate exactly how wrong that calculation is. The days that followed compressed into intense preparation, Vera pushing through healing that was not yet complete, Magnus adjusting his combat style to accommodate partnership rather than solitary dominance, both of them learning to fight not as separate wolves but as bonded pair whose movements synchronized without conscious communication. Petra and Hugo worked together, developing contingency protocols and secondary defensive plans in case the combat went badly, preparing for every possible outcome, including the one neither wanted to voice aloud, the possibility that Victor was simply better, more experienced, more willing to fight without restraint or honor. On the night before the challenge, Magnus found Vera on the fortress's highest tower, staring out at the wilderness that would tomorrow host either their victory or their death. He stood beside her in silence for long moments, both of them aware this might be their last quiet conversation, their last moment of peace before violence and consequence crashed over them with finality. "I am afraid," Vera said quietly, the admission costing her pride, but feeling necessary, feeling like truth that needed to be spoken. "Not of dying, because I have been prepared to die since the night my pack burned, but of losing you before I have the chance to understand what we might become together, of having the bond snap before it is fully formed, and spending whatever remains of my life feeling that absence like phantom limb." Magnus reached out slowly, giving her time to reject the contact, and when she did not pull away, he took her hand in his, their fingers intertwined with the easy familiarity of gesture performed countless times before, even though this was the first time they had touched deliberately, intentionally, outside combat necessity or medical emergency. "I am afraid too," he said, "afraid that my failures will cost you everything again, that my tactical errors or physical limitations will leave you undefended against Victor's assault, that you will die because I was not strong enough or fast enough or skilled enough to protect what matters most." "Then we face that fear together," Vera said, turning to meet his gaze directly, seeing her own determination reflected in his pale gold eyes. "We fight as partners, as
the mates, whether or not the bond is complete, and if we fall knowing we face the true enemy together, rather than remaining divided by his manipulations." Magnus lifted their joined hands, pressed his lips to her knuckles in gesture that was both courtly and intimate, that carried weight of promise and commitment, and hope for future neither of them could guarantee. "Tomorrow we end this," he said. "Tomorrow we make Victor Sorensen pay for everyone he took from us, and then, if we survive, I will spend the rest of my existence proving that your choice to stand with me was not mistake or capitulation, but the beginning of something worth the pain it required to find." The Alpha King made a new enemy, but he did not expect to fall in love with her. The neutral ground stretched before them like an arena carved from ancient stone and weathered earth, a circular clearing surrounded by forest that had witnessed countless territorial challenges over centuries of pack warfare and political resolution through sanctioned violence. Dawnlight cut through the trees in silver-gold streams that illuminated the space with the particular quality of illumination that made everything appear both sharper and somehow unreal, like they had stepped outside normal time into a moment that would define everything that followed. Magnus stood at the clearing's south edge with Vera beside him, both in human form as tradition required for the opening of formal challenge, both wearing minimal clothing that would not impede transformation when combat began in earnest. Victor Sorensen waited at the northern edge, and seeing him in person for the first time, Magnus understood why this wolf had survived decades of political maneuvering and territorial conquest without drawing sufficient attention to trigger coordinated opposition. He appeared unremarkable at first glance, average height for an alpha at perhaps 6 feet 3 inches, dark hair graying at the temples, lean build that suggested speed rather than overwhelming strength. But his eyes carried the particular emptiness Magnus had learned to recognize in wolves who had committed atrocities so frequently that violence no longer registered as exceptional, who had moved beyond normal pack morality into something colder and more pragmatic, something that viewed other wolves as resources to be exploited rather than beings deserving consideration or mercy. Wilhelm Grey stood at the clearing's center in his role as neutral arbiter, his white hair and ceremonial robes marking him as outside the conflict, authorized by ancient pack law to enforce rules and declare victory when conditions were met. Hugo and Petra waited at the forest's edge with a small group of witnesses permitted to observe but not intervene, their expressions carrying the particular tension of people watching loved ones walk into mortal danger without ability to influence the outcome. "The challenge is issued and accepted under old law," Wilhelm said, his voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength for someone his age. "Single combat between alphas with designated seconds permitted to fight alongside their principals. Combat continues until death or formal surrender, with surrender requiring verbal acknowledgement and physical submission witnessed by the arbiter. Violation of these terms results in immediate forfeiture and execution of the offending party. Do all parties understand and accept these conditions?" Magnus and Vera responded in unison, their voices overlapping in a way that suggested the coordination they had developed over 6 days of intensive training, the synchronization that had become instinctive rather than calculated. Victor's response came alone, confirmation that he had no second, that he intended to fight as a solitary predator against paired opponents. And Magnus felt the first stirring of concern that this confidence suggested capabilities they had not fully anticipated or prepared to counter. "Then begin," Wilhelm said, and stepped back to the clearing's edge, his role shifting from arbiter to witness, as the combat commenced under rules that predated modern pack civilization. Victor transformed immediately, his shift smooth and controlled, revealing a wolf form that matched his human appearance in being deceptively average until one noticed the scars crossing his dark fur, the particular way
He moved that suggested experience earned through countless previous battles. Magnus and Vera shifted in synchronized response, their transformations flowing into combat-ready positions without pause or hesitation, platinum and copper-red fur marking them as visually distinct pair against Victor's darker coloring. The first exchange happened too fast for human eyes to track properly, Victor closing distance with speed that belied his age, targeting Vera with calculation that suggested he had identified her as weaker link, despite her demonstrated capability during the fortress assault. But Magnus intercepted with precision born of 6 days practicing exactly this scenario, his larger frame absorbing impact meant for his mate, his jaws snapping closed on empty air as Victor twisted away with serpentine flexibility that spoke of training styles different from anything Magnus had encountered in Northern Territory combat traditions. They circled, all 3 wolves assessing and calculating, looking for openings that would not leave them fatally exposed to counterattack. Victor's strategy became clear quickly. He intended to separate them, to force Magnus to choose between defending Vera and pressing his own offensive, to exploit the mate bond as weakness rather than strength. He struck at Vera repeatedly, feints and genuine attacks mixed together in patterns designed to keep Magnus defensive, reactive rather than proactive, unable to utilize his superior size and strength because he was constantly responding to threats against his partner. But Vera was not the liability Victor assumed, was not simply bait to manipulate Magnus's responses. She moved with the efficiency Magnus had first witnessed in the training yard, her smaller size translating to speed and maneuverability that allowed her to evade strikes Victor committed to fully, that left him momentarily exposed to Magnus's counters. They developed a rhythm without conscious discussion, Vera drawing Victor's attacks while Magnus punished his extensions, both of them working not as individual fighters but as a single tactical unit whose coordination exceeded the sum of its parts. The battle continued with brutal intensity, all 3 wolves taking damage, blood staining fur and ground, exhaustion beginning to factor into calculations about risk and commitment. Victor was good, was perhaps the most skilled opponent Magnus had ever faced, his experience and willingness to fight without honor or restraint, creating advantages that pure strength could not overcome. He targeted injuries Vera had sustained during the fortress assault, reopening wounds that had not fully healed, forcing her to compensate for pain and reduced mobility that made her incrementally slower, incrementally more vulnerable. Magnus felt rage building in his chest as he watched Vera struggle, felt his wolf demanding he abandon strategy in favor of overwhelming violence that would eliminate the threat to his mate regardless of cost to himself. But Vera's voice cut through the fury, not words because they were in wolf form, but something transmitted through the mate bond that had strengthened during their preparation, during the nights they had spent learning each other's patterns and rhythms and the ways their instincts aligned even when their conscious minds disagreed. She was telling him to trust her, to maintain their coordination rather than reverting to solitary combat, to believe that together they were stronger than Victor despite his individual superiority. Magnus forced himself to listen, to suppress the protective instinct demanding he position himself between Vera and all danger, to treat her as equal partner rather than vulnerable asset requiring defense. The shift in their approach was subtle but decisive. They stopped reacting to Victor's provocations, stopped allowing him to dictate engagement terms, began instead to implement combinations they had practiced specifically for an opponent who was faster and more experienced than either of them individually. Vera feinted high while Magnus struck low, their attacks timed to arrive simultaneously from angles Victor could not defend against simultaneously, forcing him to choose which threat to address and accept damage from the other. Victor's confidence began to fracture, his movements becoming marginally more defensive, his attacks less committed.
As he recognized that his strategy was failing, that the mate bond he had intended to exploit as weakness was instead functioning as force multiplier he had not adequately prepared to counter. He made the mistake desperate fighters always made eventually, committed fully to strike intended to disable one opponent without accounting for the other's position, his jaws closing around Vera's foreleg with crushing force that would have crippled her if Magnus had not been exactly where their coordination placed him, his own jaws finding Victor's exposed throat in the same instant. They fell together in tangle of fur and blood and violence, momentum carrying all three wolves to the ground in configuration that would determine the battle's outcome in next few seconds. Magnus's teeth pressed against Victor's throat hard enough to taste blood, to feel pulse hammering against his tongue, to understand that one additional application of pressure would sever the arteries and end this permanently. Victor's jaws remained locked on Vera's leg, mutual destruction looming if either committed fully to their killing strike. Then Victor made his final mistake, releasing Vera to twist away, choosing his own survival over the opportunity to inflict permanent damage on Magnus's mate. And that choice revealed everything about his fundamental nature, his inability to understand bonds that transcended tactical calculation or personal benefit. Magnus did not release his grip, did not allow Victor to escape, applied the pressure that severed arteries and crushed windpipe and ended the life of the wolf who had manipulated them both, who had killed Magnus's sister and destroyed Vera's pack, and orchestrated suffering that had consumed years of their lives. Victor Sorensen died without dignity, without honor, bleeding out on neutral ground while Wilhelm declared Magnus and Vera victorious under the terms of ancient challenge law. They shifted back to human forms slowly, exhaustion and injury making the transformation difficult, painful, accompanied by the particular clarity that came after intense combat, when adrenaline faded and reality reasserted itself with overwhelming force. Vera collapsed against Magnus, her leg damaged enough that it could not support her weight, and he caught her automatically, holding her upright while Hugo and Petra rushed forward with medical supplies and support, while Wilhelm made formal declarations about territorial rights and political implications that Magnus barely registered through the ringing in his ears and the desperate relief flooding his system. They had survived, had achieved the vengeance both of them were owed, had ended the threat that had manipulated them into destroying each other. But the victory felt less like triumph and more like exhaustion, like the conclusion of something that had cost too much and taken too long, and left them both fundamentally altered from who they had been before this began. The 3 days that followed passed in a haze of healing and political consolidation, Magnus dealing with the territorial implications of Victor's death, while Vera recovered from injury sustained during the challenge. Wilhelm helped negotiate the transfer of Victor's holdings to Northern Territory control, the integration of displaced wolves who had served Victor through coercion rather than genuine loyalty, the establishment of new protocols meant to prevent future manipulation of the kind they had all suffered. But on the 4th morning, Magnus found Vera in the fortress gardens, staring at flowers blooming despite approaching winter, her expression carrying the particular distance that suggested she was preparing to leave, preparing to return to whatever remained of her rogue network now that Victor was dead, and the purpose that had defined her for 7 years had been achieved. "I do not know how to do this," Vera said when she sensed his approach, not turning to face him, her voice quiet and raw. "I do not know how to be something other than survivor seeking vengeance, how to build life from anything except grief and rage, and the determination to make someone pay for what I lost. Victor is dead, my pack is avenged, and I am left with emptiness where purpose used to be, with no clear understanding of who I am supposed to become now." Magnus moved to stand beside her, close enough to feel her warmth, but not touching, respecting the space she seemed to need. "You become whoever you choose," he said. "You build life from the same strength that allowed you to survive 7 years alone, the same tactical brilliance that made you a threat to an alpha king,
the same capacity for loyalty that inspired dozens of displaced wolves to follow you despite the danger. And if you choose to build that life here, with me, I will help you create something that honors your past rather than demanding you forget it. Vera turned finally, her forest green eyes meeting his with vulnerability he had rarely seen from her, with fear that matched his own. "I hate that I love you," she said, the words emerging like confession, like accusation, like truth that hurt to acknowledge. "I hate that my heart has made peace with you while my mind still catalogs every loss, every death, every year I spent alone because you failed to verify intelligence before destroying innocence. But I cannot walk away from you, cannot make myself choose survival over the bond, and I resent that biology has trapped me into forgiving what should be unforgivable." "Then do not forgive me," Magnus said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them, as he recognized their truth. "Do not forgive me, and do not forget what I took from you, but choose to build future anyway. Choose to love me despite the damage rather than because you have moved past it. I do not want absolution I have not earned. Do not want you to pretend the past did not happen. I want you to acknowledge all of it, the grief and the rage and the justified hatred, and choose me anyway. Choose us anyway, because what we could become together is worth the pain it requires to get there." Vera stared at him for a long moment, tears sliding down her cheeks, her whole body trembling with emotion that had been suppressed too long, that had finally found outlet in this garden where flowers bloomed despite winter approaching, despite circumstances that should have prevented growth or beauty or hope. Then she closed the distance between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that tasted like salt and surrender, and the beginning of something neither of them fully understood, but both were willing to build toward. 6 months later, the memorial garden was complete. Stone markers bearing names of the Western Coastal Pack and Magnus's sister, arranged in peaceful configuration, surrounded by flowers that bloomed year-round through a combination of careful cultivation and minor magic Wilhelm had helped establish. Vera stood at its center, with Magnus beside her, her hand resting on the subtle swell of her abdomen where their child grew, product of completed mate bond and conscious choice to create future from wreckage of past. They still fought sometimes, still had days where grief overwhelmed them both and old anger surfaced in arguments that required hours to resolve, still struggled with the reality that love and trauma coexisted in ways that were messy and complicated and required constant work to navigate. But they were building something, slowly and with deliberate care, structure that honored loss while refusing to be defined entirely by it. Petra and Hugo stood nearby, their own relationship having developed from tactical partnership into something deeper, their present steadying influence when Magnus and Vera both needed reminder that healing was a process rather than destination. The Northern Territory had changed under their joint leadership, policies shifting to protect displaced wolves and prevent the kind of systematic exploitation Victor had practiced, creating systems meant to catch manipulation before it could metastasize into genocide. It was not redemption, Magnus thought as Vera leaned against him, as he felt their child move beneath his hand pressed to her stomach, as he looked at a garden honoring the dead and preparing space for the living. It was not forgiveness or absolution or any clean resolution that would erase the damage or restore what had been lost. It was simply choice, repeated daily, to build something worth the pain it required, to love despite grief, to hope despite trauma, to believe that future could be different from past even when past had carved itself permanently into both their hearts. And for now, in this garden where flowers bloomed and names were remembered and new life grew, that was enough.